is this creature? She doesn't belong in this hall. She's ruined!
Fabric tore with the sickening sound of a slaughtered pig. Not a clean rip, but a jagged, agonizing screech of cheap silk giving way. Hundreds of powdered heads turned. Beatrix didn't cry. She just stared at the drafty floor, waiting for the cold stone to swallow her whole. Beeswax and body odor. That was what high society smelled like beneath the suffocating layers of rosewater. Beatrix stood near the draughty eastern wall of the grand assembly room, her spine rigid against the creeping ache in her lower back. The room was a furnace, overstuffed with desperate nobility, and lit by 300 candles that were rapidly consuming all the breathable air. Sweat trickled down her ribs, pooling at the tight, unyielding edge of her corset. It was a second-hand garment, reboned with cheap whalebone that dug a dull, persistent bruise into her left hip with every breath. She shifted her weight, feeling the familiar, sharp bite of a blister rupturing on her heel. "Stop fidgeting. You look like a diseased pigeon," Caroline hissed. Her stepsister didn't even turn her head to deliver the insult, her gaze fixed with terrifying intensity on the dais at the far end of the room. Caroline's jaw was clamped so tight a muscle ticked near her ear. She smelled of nervous perspiration and expensive French powder, a cloying, sweet dust that made Beatrix want to sneeze. "I have a blister," Beatrix muttered, keeping her eyes glued to the scuffed toes of her boots. They were hidden, barely, by the faded mauve hem of her gown. "Then bleed quietly." Harriet, the younger of the two, chimed in from Beatrix's other side. Harriet was systematically crushing a silk fan between her damp, gloved hands. "If you distract him when he looks this way, I will take a shears to your remaining hair." Beatrix said nothing. She tasted salt and copper on her tongue from chewing the inside of her cheek. This entire evening was a grotesque pantomime, and she was merely a prop. Lady Margaret, her stepmother, had made that abundantly clear before shoving Beatrix into the carriage. "You are going to carry their trains, fix their hems, and make them look luminous by comparison. Do not speak. Do not eat. Do not exist unless required." The bride selection. Even the name made Beatrix's stomach turn over, heavy and sour. Anthony Pendleton, the Duke of Westshire, needed a wife. The old Duke had died of gout and bad temper 6 months prior, leaving a crumbling estate and a mountain of debts that Anthony had miraculously settled through sheer brute force capitalism in the shipping trade. Now, tradition and a rather vicious decree from the crown demanded he marry. And so, the local gentry had herded their daughters into this sweltering room like prized heifers at a county fair. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, snapping Beatrix out of her grim reverie. The heavy oak doors at the front of the hall had opened. The Duke was here. Beatrix craned her neck slightly, catching a glimpse between the towering, feathered headdresses of the women in front of them. She expected a preening aristocrat, dripping in velvet and arrogance. Instead, the man walking up the central aisle looked like he wanted to murder someone. Anthony Pendleton did not glide. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps, his boots striking the polished floorboards with dull thuds. He was dressed in formal evening wear, but the black coat looked uncomfortable on his broad shoulders, pulling tight across the back. His cravat wasn't perfectly starched. It sat a fraction too loose, as if he had tried to rip it off in the carriage and had been scolded into leaving it alone. He didn't look like a savior or a romantic hero. He looked exhausted. Dark circles hung under eyes the color of unpolished iron. His jaw was covered in the faint shadow of a desperately needed shave, and his mouth was set in a hard, grim line. "He hates this as much as I do," Beatrix realized with a sudden, jarring jolt of clarity. The thought wasn't comforting. It just made the whole spectacle feel infinitely more pathetic. A room full of women carving themselves into corsets and plastering their faces with lead paint for a man who looked like he'd rather be standing in the rain. "He's looking this way," Caroline whispered, her voice trembling. "Harriet, my posture." Is it right? You're stiff as a corpse. Breathe, Harriet snapped back, though her own neck was flushed with a blotchy red rash of anxiety. The line began to move. The ceremony dictated that the women would approach the dais in groups of 3, curtsy, and step back. It was a painfully slow process, a conveyor belt of polite, insincere smiles and desperate, darting eyes. Beatrix fell into step behind her stepsisters, gathering the heavy, embroidered trains of their gowns in her raw, calloused hands. The fabric was heavy, real velvet and thick silk. Her own dress, a hand-me-down from an aunt, deceased some 10 years, felt like tissue paper by comparison. The seams at her waist were strained, held together by a prayer and thick cotton thread she had sewn herself by candlelight. The heat was becoming unbearable. The scent of melting wax, sour breath, and desperate perfume was a physical weight pushing down on Beatrix's chest. The whalebone dug deeper. She breathed through her mouth, trying to stave off the dizziness that threatened to blur the edges of her vision. Step. Wait. Step. Wait. They were 5 groups away, then 3. Then they were next. Lady Margaret appeared from the sidelines, her fingers digging like talons into Beatrix's upper arm. When they drop into the curtsy, you step back. Do not crowd them. If you step on Caroline's train, I will leave you in the streets of London. Yes, ma'am, Beatrix breathed. Her arm throbbed where the woman's nails bit into the flesh. Go. The usher slammed his staff against the floor. Lady Caroline and Lady Harriet of House Sterling, accompanied by Miss Beatrix. They stepped out into the open space before the dais. The air was marginally cooler here, away from the crush of bodies. Beatrix kept her head bowed, staring at the polished wood. She could feel the Duke's gaze. It didn't feel like a caress. It felt like a physical pressure, a heavy, tired scrutiny sweeping over the 3 of them. Your Grace, Caroline practically purred, the sound entirely at odds with the frantic, bird-like energy vibrating through her limbs. They began their descent into the curtsy. Beatrix stepped back, exactly as instructed. She moved her left foot, putting her weight on the ruptured blister. A sharp spike of pain shot up her calf, causing her ankle to wobble. She compensated, shifting her right foot slightly to the side to keep her balance. It was a small movement, harmless, but Caroline, terrified of losing the Duke's attention, had stepped backward instead of sinking straight down. Her heavy, wooden-heeled shoe came down hard, not on the floor, on the flimsy, threadbare fabric of Beatrix's skirt. Beatrix rose from her curtsy. Caroline remained anchored to the floor, her heel pressing Beatrix's skirt against the polished wood. The physics of the disaster were instantaneous and unforgiving. As Beatrix's torso moved up, the trapped fabric pulled taut. The ancient seams at her waist, already stressed to the breaking point by the poorly fitted corset, surrendered. Re-e-e-ip. The sound was violently loud. It wasn't a delicate parting of threads. It was a guttural, echoing shriek of silk and cotton, tearing from the waistline down past her mid-thigh. Beatrix froze. For one long, agonizing second, the ballroom ceased to exist. All sound vanished. The musicians stopped mid-bow. The whispering crowd fell dead silent. The only thing Beatrix could hear was the frantic, uneven hammering of her own blood in her ears. Cold air hit her right leg. She looked down. The entire side of her gown hung open, flapping uselessly like a broken wing. Beneath it, her plain, unadorned cotton chemise and the ugly, practical laces of her corset were fully exposed to 300 members of polite society. A collective gasp sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. Then came the whispers. They started like dry leaves scraping across pavement, escalating quickly into a vicious, buzzing hive of scandalized murmurs. Good God! The undergarments. Did you see? Absolute ruin. Doing it for attention, surely. Beatrix didn't move. She couldn't. Her body felt paralyzed, encased in ice. A hot, ugly flush crept up her neck, burning her cheeks, but she didn't cry. The humiliation was too vast, too absolute for tears. She felt entirely outside her own body, watching a pathetic, ragged creature stand half-naked in a ballroom. Her hands, trembling violently, finally reacted. She clamped them over the gaping hole in her dress, her blunt, unmanicured fingers desperately trying to pinch the ruined fabric together. It was useless. The tear was too large. Caroline stood up, looking over her shoulder. Her eyes widened, but not with horror for Beatrix. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, self-righteous fury. "You clumsy, wretched idiot," Caroline hissed under her breath, stepping away as if Beatrix were contagious. "You've ruined my presentation." Harriet simply turned her back, raising her fan to hide her face from the mortification of being associated with the disaster. Off to the side, Lady Margaret's face was the color of chalk. She looked at Beatrix with a disgust so pure it felt like a physical blow. She didn't step forward to help. No one did. They just stared, feeding on the spectacle. Beatrix swallowed hard, her throat clicking dryly. She needed to run. She needed to turn around and walk out the doors, but her legs refused to obey. Her knees felt like water. She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing to bolt, preparing to fall, just waiting for the nightmare to end. Heavy footsteps echoed on the dais. Thud, 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 thud. The whispering faltered, then died out completely. Beatrix opened her eyes. Anthony Pendleton was walking down the 3 wooden steps of the dais. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Caroline, who was currently attempting a fragile, appealing smile. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on Beatrix. Up close, the exhaustion in his face was even more pronounced. He looked older than his 30 years. There were deep lines framing his mouth, and a faint scar cut through his left eyebrow. He wasn't glaring at her. He didn't look pitying either. He just looked thoroughly fed up with the entire room. As he closed the distance, his hands went to the heavy silver clasp at his throat. He was wearing a formal, military-style cloak over his coat-thick, midnight blue wool, lined with black silk. With a sharp flick of his wrists, he unfastened it. He stopped directly in front of her. Beatrix shrank back slightly, her hands still desperately clutching her ruined skirt, her knuckles white. She smelled him then. He didn't smell of civet or cloying perfume. He smelled of rain on cobblestones, damp wool, and a faint, sharp tang of wood smoke. Anthony didn't say a word to her stepsisters. He didn't make a grand, theatrical gesture to the crowd. He simply lifted the heavy wool cloak and draped it over Beatrix's trembling shoulders. The sudden weight of it almost buckled her knees. It was massive, swamping her small frame completely, falling all the way to her scuffed boots and entirely concealing the torn dress, the ugly corset, the cheap chemise. It was incredibly warm. Beatrix gasped, a small, involuntary sound. Her frozen hands released their death grip on her skirt and moved up to clutch the edges of the cloak, pulling the heavy wool tight across her chest. Anthony stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He looked down at her. His iron-gray eyes swept over her pale, terrified face, taking in her trembling lip and the rigid set of her shoulders. He leaned in slightly. When he spoke, his voice was a low, rough rumble, pitched so quietly that only she could hear it. "It is abominably draughty in this room, my lady," he said. His tone was perfectly flat, completely devoid of pity, but grounded in a quiet, undeniable authority. "You should keep that on." Beatrix stared up at him, her chest heaving. She didn't swoon. She didn't feel a magical spark of fairy tale romance. She felt a sudden, fierce anchor drop into the chaotic, spiraling panic of her mind. He was real. The cloak was real. Thank you," she rasped. Her voice sounded like broken glass. Anthony nodded once, a sharp, terse movement. He didn't step back immediately. He slowly turned his head, casting a cold, dead-eyed glare over the silent crowd. He looked at Caroline, who shrank back as if she'd been slapped. He looked at Lady Margaret, who immediately dropped her gaze to the floor. Finally, Anthony looked back at Beatrix. The harshness in his face softened by a microscopic fraction. "Do you require an escort to your carriage?" he asked softly. Beatrix swallowed the lump of humiliation lodged in her throat. She gripped the edges of his cloak tighter, feeling the rough texture of the wool against her palms. It felt like armor. "No, Your Grace," she said, finding a sliver of her voice. It was shaking, but it was hers. "I believe I know the way out." He held her gaze for a second longer, as if judging whether she would collapse the moment he walked away. Seemingly satisfied that she wouldn't, he stepped aside, clearing a path for her through the center of the ballroom. "Then I bid you good evening," Anthony said. Beatrix didn't look at her stepsisters. She didn't look at the crowd. Wrapped in the heavy, smoke-scented cloak of the Duke of Westshire, Beatrix turned her back on the dais and began the long walk toward the oak doors. Her blister screamed with every step, and her cheeks still burned with residual shame, but she walked with her spine straight. Behind her, she heard the heavy, deliberate thud of the Duke's boots as he turned his back on the rest of the room and returned to his seat, plunging the bride selection into a paralyzed, deafening silence. Rain hammered against the cracked glass of the attic window. It was a cold, spiteful drizzle that seeped through the roof tiles and smelled of wet soot. Beatrix sat on the edge of her narrow cot, a damp cloth pressed to her blistered heel. The skin was raw, weeping a thin, clear fluid that stung sharply against the coarse linen. Downstairs, the house was a hornet's nest of slammed doors and shrill weeping. Lady Margaret had spent the carriage ride home screaming until her voice gave out, blaming Beatrix's sheer existence for Caroline's failure to secure a private audience with the Duke. Beatrix had taken the verbal thrashing in silence, her hands buried deep in the pockets of the midnight blue wool cloak. The cloak. It currently draped over the back of her solitary, splintering wooden chair, utterly dwarfing the meager furniture. In the gray, bruised light of dawn, the heavy fabric looked black. It still smelled of damp cobblestones and wood smoke. It felt like a trespasser in her miserable room, a piece of another world that had accidentally tumbled into hers. She had tried to fold it, but her hands had shaken too much, so she draped it, leaving it as a silent sentry in the corner. A sharp rap at her door shattered the quiet. Before she could answer, the door shoved inward, scraping loudly against the uneven floorboards. It was Mary, the scullery maid, her hands coated in flour and her face flushed. "He's here," Mary gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "Downstairs, in the drawing room." Beatrix's stomach dropped, cold and heavy as a stone. "Who?" "The Duke." Mary's eyes were wide, darting to the cloak over the chair. "He came in a carriage with 4 black horses. Lady Margaret is tearing apart the parlor trying to find the good tea service. She told me to fetch you." "Me?" Beatrix whispered. "She said to bring the cloak. And to look presentable, whatever that means. Hurry, miss." She looked ready to take a rolling pin to my head. Beatrix didn't have anything presentable. Her only formal gown was currently a pile of shredded silk on the sewing room floor. She looked down at what she was wearing. A faded gray wool skirt pilled from washing, and a plain white blouse with mended cuffs. She had no powder, no rouge, just the dark circles under her eyes and hair that refused to stay pinned back. She stood, wincing as her injured heel took her weight. She walked over to the chair and gathered the heavy cloak into her arms. It was so large, she had to bundle it tightly against her chest to keep it from dragging on the floor. The descent down the back stairs felt like walking to a gallows. She could hear the frantic murmur of voices from the drawing room long before she reached the landing. Caroline was laughing a high, forced sound that scraped like a tin cup against iron. Beatrix pushed open the heavy mahogany door just a fraction. The room smelled of old lavender and anxious sweat. Lady Margaret sat on the edge of the settee, her back rigid. Caroline and Harriet were perched opposite, draped in morning gowns that probably cost more than the house's yearly coal budget. Anthony Pendleton stood by the window, his broad back turned to the women. He was staring out at the miserable rain, a cup of untouched tea rattling slightly in his hand. He wore a heavy riding coat, splashed with mud at the hem. He looked even more irritated today than he had the night before. "It is a lovely estate, Your Grace, though a bit drafty in the winters," Caroline was saying, her voice strained. Anthony didn't turn around. "Is it? Oh, yes. But we make do. My mother has such an eye for interiors." Beatrix took a breath, holding the heavy wool tighter against her chest, and stepped into the room. "You sent for me, stepmother?" The forced smiles on the faces of the three women instantly curdled into sneers. Lady Margaret shot out of her seat, moving to intercept Beatrix before she could cross the threshold. "Give it to me," Lady Margaret hissed under her breath, reaching for the bundled cloak. "And then get back upstairs. You're a disgrace." "Leave it." The voice stopped Lady Margaret dead in her tracks. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. Anthony turned away from the window. He set the delicate teacup on the sill with a heavy clatter that made Harriet jump. He ignored the stepmother entirely and walked straight toward Beatrix. He stopped 3 feet away. In the harsh daylight, the scar through his eyebrow was stark white against his skin. He looked her up and down, taking in the faded gray skirt, the mended cuffs, and the absolute absence of powder or artifice on her face. "You did not send it back with a footman," Anthony said. "I have no footman, Your Grace," Beatrix replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the violent hammering in her chest, "and I did not wish to trust it to a hired boy. The wool is quite heavy. It would drag." She held the bundle out to him. Anthony didn't take it. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his mud-splattered coat. "Keep it." Lady Margaret made a sound, somewhere between a choke and a gasp. "Your Grace, surely." "I am speaking to her," Anthony interrupted, not taking his eyes off Beatrix. The room fell into a terrified silence. He tilted his head slightly. "You limped when you walked in just now." "The left foot." Beatrix felt the heat rise in her cheeks. "It is a blister from the boots last night. They are ill-fitting. And your dress? Torn beyond repair." She looked down at the bundle of wool in her arms, suddenly exhausted by the sheer effort of standing up straight. "But I suspect you already knew that. It was quite the spectacle." "It was a massacre," Anthony corrected dryly, "though entirely the fault of the heavy-footed creature behind you." Behind him, Caroline let out a muffled sob of outrage, but Anthony paid no attention. He leaned in closer to Beatrix, lowering his voice so only she could hear over the rain hitting the glass. "I despise the city," he said. It was a bizarre confession, delivered with the blunt force of a physical blow. "I despise the perfume. I despise the smiling, and the curtsying, and the endless, suffocating greed of it all." Beatrix looked up at him, startled. "Then why were you there?" "Because my solicitors inform me that if I do not marry within the year, the Crown has the authority to seize the Western shipping docks to settle a historical grievance my idiot father left behind." He said it with deep, unmasked bitterness. "I require a wife, not a romance, not a partner in high society. I need someone to manage the estate, tolerate my long absences at the docks, and refrain from spending my money on French powder." Beatrix stared at him. The smell of wet wool and wood smoke enveloped her again, blocking out the stale lavender of the drawing room. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you did not cry last night," Anthony said softly. "You stood there, humiliated in front of half of London, and you didn't shed a single tear. You just held your head up and walked out." He pulled one hand from his pocket and finally rested it on top of the bundled cloak she carried. His fingers brushed against her knuckles. His hands were rough, calloused from ropes and cold weather, not smooth, like a gentleman's. "I do not want a delicate flower," Anthony continued. "I want someone made of iron, someone who understands what it means to survive a miserable situation." He stepped back, raising his voice to its normal volume. He looked at Lady Margaret, who was trembling with a mixture of terror and fury. I will have my solicitors send the draft of the settlements by tomorrow morning, Anthony addressed the older woman, though his tone suggested he was talking to a stray dog. They will be generous enough to ensure I never have to look at your face again. If you attempt to negotiate, I will cut the sum in half. He turned back to Beatrix. He didn't smile. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but something far more potent, a mutual understanding, a pact. Pack your things, Anthony said to her. Leave the corset. I despise them. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out of the room, his boots leaving faint smears of mud on Lady Margaret's pristine carpet. The heavy front door slammed shut a moment later, vibrating the window panes. Beatrix stood in the sudden, ringing silence of the drawing room. Caroline was crying in earnest now, ugly, hitching sobs of ruined ambition. Lady Margaret was slumped on the settee, clutching her chest. Beatrix didn't look at them. She looked down at the heavy, dark wool in her arms. Slowly, deliberately, she unrolled the cloak. She swung it around her shoulders, letting the heavy fabric settle over her faded, mended dress. It fit perfectly. Without a word to the women behind her, Beatrix turned and walked toward the stairs. She had packing to do. If you loved this raw, unapologetic take on historical romance, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dive storytelling. Beatrix and Anthony's journey proves that sometimes the best match isn't built on fairy dust, but on mutual survival and undeniable grit. Share this video with your fellow drama lovers to help our channel grow, and tell us in the comments what was your favorite moment from their unapologetic, mud-splattered confrontation.
Hi, my name is Outlaw Romance, the owner and manager of Outlaw Romance. After watching the video, her stepsisters ripped her gown at the bride selection to shame her, until the Duke gave his cloak. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the contrast between cruelty and kindness. Moments of humiliation can be difficult to watch, but seeing someone step forward with compassion and respect can completely change the tone of a story. It's often those simple acts of dignity and support that leave the strongest impression. Do you think the Duke acted out of instinct? Or did he already see something special in her before that moment? And which scene stood out to you the most as the story unfolded? I'd love to hear how you felt about the characters and their choices. One lesson I take from stories like this is that a small act of kindness have a much bigger impact than we realize. In everyday life, treating people with respect, especially when they're facing embarrassment or hardship, can make all the difference. Thank you for spending time with Outlaw Romance today. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy historical romance stories like this one, a like or subscription is always appreciated.